on Sky News Australia starts now. This is Outsiders.
Good morning and happy Easter. And welcome to Outsiders, the show that is to woke identity politics and cultural Marxism on steroids. What the ALP, the Albanese Labor Party, is to competent governance.
I just find this unbelievable because Minister Giles has given assurance after assurance that these criminals that he's released from immigration detention are being continually monitored. That's what he said repeatedly, and people have taken some reassurance of that, particularly the original victims of crime who were violated against by some of these individuals. The family members of those people who were murdered had listened to the minister and said everything's under control.
Yes, it seems the biggest mistake you can make these days is take the Albanese government at its word.
As you say, people aren't being monitored. They're not wearing ankle bracelets, and the government has legislation to apply to the court to bring some of these people back into detention. They've not made a single application to the court to get somebody back in off the streets and to stop offending against Australian citizens.
Well, that was Peter Dutton, of course, explaining how he shares the utter disbelief, joined by all other Australians, at just how utterly incompetent this government is.
I find it just, really upsetting in a sense because I know that there will be further victims of crime, and Mr Albanese seems not to have a clue as to what he's doing.
Yes, and that's not the only area in which the Albanese government has proved definitively that it is, in the words of Dennis Shanahan, the worst government since Whitlam's. And that's saying something, as we shall discover as we dive into the latest Outsiders news. Well, Rita and James got a huge show coming up. We'll be chatting to Matt Canavan. Can't wait to chat to him. But this detainees thing, this security lapse who got half the people they released, which they shouldn't have released, in my opinion, wandering around without ankle bracelets. No one knows what's going on. You've got two clownish ministers. Rita, your take on it.
Well, I'm shocked they've got around half not wearing ankle bracelets. This is one of the measures that we were told was going to be taken, and yet they are just floundering in this area despite having a significant amount of time now to come up with some policies just to say we take this seriously, we're working on it, and we're going to ensure the community is safe whilst we have a long-term solution. But even the short-term solution, and James, the department official seems to also be clueless about what's happening because a lot of the questions that were asked, he didn't have answers for.
Well, there's been so much that's happened the past week in Canberra. I was there for part of it, and I can tell you what, the government had an absolute shocker this week here. I mean, they tried this little stunt here, Rowan and Rita, where they thought they'd put up this legislation that would make them seem all really tough on, illegal arrivals and all of that, giving them these new powers to deport and detain. But, they made this huge mistake because they had it ready on Friday. They didn't tell the opposition till, I think, Tuesday morning that this was coming and happening, gave them a 20-minute briefing and then said, well, come and support us. But, of course, they're trying to undo what they did with the NZYQ legislation where they didn't do anything. So they've over-egged this one. They suffered a humiliating defeat. They had in the Senate the Greens, the Liberals, the independent crossbenchers all say, no, we're not going along with this rush piece of legislation. And the fact is, Rowan and Rita, why this is such a debacle is that Labor doesn't believe really in borders. Andrew Giles, the immigration minister,
100%.
he got into politics after working as a lawyer for the Tampa refugees. Anthony Albanese, as recently as 2015 at the Labor conference, voted with his own hand against a motion to make it easier on the Labor Party platform to turn back boats when safe to do so. So, their heart simply isn't in it, and that's why they keep making all these mistakes.
Let's have a listen to Senator James Paterson in Parliament this week.
Of the 73, What crimes have they previously committed? Are any of them among them the 7 murderers, for example?
I don't have that breakdown of data.
I said that these were issues that I was going to raise and that I expected answers to. I assure you it's of interest to the community to know whether there are any people who previously committed a murder who are now free in the community without even ankle bracelets on.
With such small numbers of people, I mean, we're talking about 150 people, we have to be careful about privacy as well and identifying individuals.
I don't want to know who they are, where they're from. I just want to know, how about the sex offenders? There were 37 of those. Are any of them in the community at the moment not wearing an ankle bracelet?
And we took that on notice and we took the question as well.
Anyone watching this hearing will see an apparent attempt to cover up and protect the government's interests here.
Now, when I
Wow.
started that section on the show called Clown Show, obviously someone in the Labor Party thought, ooh, that's not a clown show, this is a clown show. We can show you a real clown show. And they're certainly doing it. But as James says, Rita, Labor do not believe in border security. That's in their DNA. It's the same with the Democrats in America. It's the same with left-wing governments throughout Europe. We are now at the mercy of a left-wing government that don't believe in border policy, and we end up with rapists and murderers and sex offenders running around without any kind of proper monitoring, despite that being the promise. This is serious stuff. Labor will lecture us on, you looked at so-and-so the wrong way, or you used the wrong pronoun. But they're quite happy for rapists, murderers and serial sex offenders to be wandering the streets, Rita.
Well, we've got to respect their privacy at all times, obviously. I mean, we can't be even answering questions about, are there any rapists, murderers out there, out of this group, who are not wearing ankle bracelets? How can you turn up and you don't have answers to those questions? You would think that would be a pretty obvious line of inquiry, but no. So we are none the wiser. There's a lot more questions that need answering. And it's the long-term solutions. I mean, ankle bracelets are fine for the time being, but what is the long-term plan to make sure that Labor's got a hold of this? Because you're right, they don't believe in this. They've inherited a raft of policies that they acknowledge electorally are enormously popular, so they have to enforce them. But when any issue comes up that isn't already dealt with, they flounder. It's not something that they care about. Ideologically, they're opposed to it, and it shows.
But the key things, James, that we keep seeing from this government, apart from the incompetence, which is just staggering, and on an industrial scale incompetence, but the secrecy surrounding so many Labor policies. We'll be talking later to Robert Milner about the nature positive plan, which we've raised on this show before. That's being drafted in secrecy by Tanya Plibersek's mob. Climate change stuff. That's very, very dangerous legislation which is coming forward. We also had Claire Chandler exposing, or trying to expose, the secrecy surrounding the Iranian Revolutionary Guard and having them kind of registered as terrorists. It's a complicated story, but the point is, yet again, just have a listen to Claire Chandler, they're not even getting answers to the most simple and basic things. This Labor government operates in the shadows, it operates in secrecy, it doesn't believe in what it presents to you, as it's running its own hard left agenda behind the scenes. Have a listen.
Everybody in this Senate knows that the IRGC is involved in terrorist activity. Everyone in this Senate knows that the government knows it, because that is why the documents that we have sought to compel the government to provide were created. So how can the confidential disclosure of 2 documents based on publicly available open source information to the Parliamentary Committee with specific oversight of security and intelligence matters possibly create a risk to our national interest, which is the grounds upon which the government has again refused this request today? So we know the government departments prepared documents for the terror listing of the IRGC, and we know that members of the Albanese government's cabinet made sure that that listing was shut down.
So Claire Chandler does a great job on so many fronts. She'll be pursuing that one, and so she should. James, incompetence, secrecy. Not a great recipe for a democratically elected government, is it?
Well, you can think about, and I'm sure everybody at home may have their own examples of this, but this is a government, and remember, they came into power and still love whacking their predecessors in the Morrison government for secrecy, the secret ministries and all of that sort of stuff. But time and time again, Anthony Albanese's instincts are to be secretive, tricky, to hide. I mean, think about the stage 3 tax cuts. Think about, everything that went, no, everything's going to be fine. It's gonna be fine. Think about The Voice. Think about other things like, we're going to hide the reports on politicians' expenses. All of these sorts of things that they'd have to go out and be FOI'd to bring them to light. And it's really very hard for them to claim now that they are at all in the way they've behaved with the detainees and the secrecy around who has done what and who is in the community. And when they said, oh, we don't know, it's a matter for local law enforcement, and, washed their hands, which is a good metaphor for Easter coming after Good Friday, of the crimes that have been committed by these detainees. It's just secrecy all around, and they have no right, I think, to harp on about how their predecessors in the coalition or the opposition are at all secretive or tricky.
Exactly.
Well, they came to power promising us integrity. Remember,
Correct.
we had the
That's
Federal
right.
Integrity Commission. We don't even have clarity about how they came up with a multi-million-dollar payout in the Brittany Higgins case. And
Correct.
I know that the defamation proceedings Bruce Lehman's involved with Channel 10, there's going to be a announcement or a finding on Thursday morning.
Thursday morning at 10 a.m. Make sure you watch that here on Sky. That'll be the Bruce Lehman verdict, the defamation verdict, right here on Sky. Do not miss that. Very, very important. We'll be chatting about that later. But also, Rita and James, we had the... Kevin Rudd, good old Kevin Rudd.
Oh,
I mean, come on, let's lighten up the mood a little. Let's get back to something genuinely humorous, and that is Kevin Rudd in whatever he does. This time he's prancing around the United States with his First Nations US ties. So Kevin Rudd is strengthening. So this is... We had Labor put in a First Nations ambassador. I thought the whole point that we were all equal, but no, apparently not. Kevin Rudd has a special group out there doing special favours in the US there, James. Yeah. What is this all about?
Well, I mean, this is about sort of, a trade meet and greet here, but it is ultimately about this idea, this bizarre idea, which was put forward by Penny Wong to have a First Nations ambassador, or rather, an ambassador for First Nations Australians, which is exactly what Australians voted against. In their number with The Voice to say, no, we do not have a voice or a separate chamber of parliament or whatever it was for First Nations people. That's a Canadian term, by the way, that we've imported too, which is ridiculous. And we do not have them have their own now diplomatic corps. And I think our ambassador there is Justin Mohammed is our First Nations ambassador from Australia to, I guess, the Native American tribes in the United States. But this is racial separatism infecting even foreign policy. The one area where you would think, the government, the department spoke for the entire nation on the world stage. It's ridiculous.
Exactly. The point of an ambassador is it represents the entire nation. Now we have separate ambassadors for separate races or separate categories or groups, identity politics. It's insanity. As James said, we voted comprehensively against The Voice, yet Labor throughout this country are defying the will of the people. We saw the South Australian Voice come in, which is an absolute farce, a joke. We'll be talking about that in a second. You couldn't make this stuff up. It's so humorous and so pathetic what Labor have done there in South Australia. And here we have Kevin Rudd and others, Penny Wong, rushing around, ignoring the will of the people. You don't do that if you're a democratically elected government. We had the referendum. Start listening to what the people said. Rita, we've also got this talking about... authoritarian Labor. We've got this e-safety commissioner who was put in there by the coalition. She seems to be at war with Elon Musk and Twitter, now called X. Why do we need an e-safety commissioner, and why is she at war with the one social media platform that's determined to guarantee free speech, Rita? Well,
she's failed spectacularly here because it has now emerged what she has tried to censor, threatening almost an $800,000 fine against X if they don't take down this post by Billboard Chris, who's an activist I've had on the program. We'll have him back. He basically is the father of 2 young children, and he doesn't want to have medical treatments inflicted on children, as the NHS in the UK has just decided there'll be no people doing that. But he put a post up about this trans expert from Australia, which our Office of E-Safety decided was, I don't know, harem. It had to come down. And X is now challenging this. They're going to legally challenge it. I think it's going to be very illuminating indeed to see how often this has happened. These offices, these positions are always sold on the very noble aims of we're going to stamp out child exploitation, child porn. We all want that. But then they morph into something entirely different, which is quite sinister, to suppress free speech, to stop Australians knowing what is happening. And during the COVID era, they were very busy indeed. And a lot of the information they suppressed ended up being actually 100% accurate. So
Absolutely.
you had
Absolutely.
experts whose opinions were suppressed, experts who were questioning the merits of lockdowns or mandates, all sorts of
masks.
draconian measures,
Yeah.
wearing masks outdoors, for example, the impact on children for school closures, and those very
Well, we'll be
relevant
chatting
talking
about
points
all
were
that
suppressed.
COVID misinformation shortly with John Campbell, who is over here. But just very quickly, we're going to go to Matt Canavan in a second. But just let me just quickly say that on April the 2nd, that's on Tuesday, there is a kind of draw out cash day, a social media campaign calling on Australians to withdraw cash from your nearest ATM on Tuesday, April 2nd, in protest against the shift to these digital payments. We've had digital IDs ran through Parliament. We've had the clown who runs the Commonwealth Bank wandering around saying people should be allowed to have more than $500
What?
cash.
What?
Yes. So
500?
exactly. Let's get cash
How am I
out
supposed
on
to pay a
Tuesday.
tradie?
Everybody go to your cash point and get out cash. Let's get cash moving again. Very important, because cash equals freedom, and they are doing everything. We'll talk about the digital ID as well. They are doing everything to push us into this digital CBDC world, which is absolutely a prison, basically, a technological
and it's
prison.
anti-migrant, because, as you know, my people love cash. They love cash more. What was that line from The Castle? What is it with wogs and cash? We love cash. So this, I think,
Good.
you could take this to the Australian Human Rights Commission on a race-based basis. I don't know if I might do
So
that.
get your cash out on Tuesday. Get your cash out. Let's show them we still love cash. Let's go now to Matt Canavan. Senator Matt Canavan, great. Happy Easter, mate. Great to see you. You're in your garage.
hello.
I can see you're in your garage, mate. You're tuning a few of your cars this morning, are you?
Yeah, exactly. Happy Easter to you all. What else would we be doing? I wish this was my garage, but no, unfortunately, I'm just here at Rocky Nats. But it's been a great festival of cars. And how good is burnt rubber smell in the morning? So get yourself down here if you're in the Rocky region. It's on for the whole of Easter weekend.
Fantastic. Well, while you're there, let's talk about the disaster of EVs. I don't know if any of those are EVs behind you. We've seen in America that the EV thing is collapsing all around them. Car manufacturers are pulling out of EVs. The share stockholders are going, nah, this doesn't work for us. And yet we've got Chris Bowen wandering around trying to mandate more and more usage of EVs in Australia. What's actually going on, Matt?
Well, look, I've got nothing against electric vehicles. If you want to drive one, good luck to you. It's a free country. I didn't see too many of them at Rocky Nats. In fact, I didn't see a single one at Rocky Nats yesterday and here today. I mean, look, people just want to have fun in this country, and if people want to drive a car which makes a bit of noise and burns some rubber, does some donuts every now and again in a safe and legal space, good luck to them. I mean, why do we want a government telling us what to do in our lives? As I say, if you want to drive an EV through your inner city, they're actually quite fun to drive. Good luck to you. But some people, of course, like to drive these type of cars behind me. They're beautiful and they're great hobbies. Good luck to the people who do that. And, of course, some people absolutely have to buy a fossil fuel car. Tradies, of course, have to do that. Large families, truck drivers, all need these vehicles to just go about their lives or earn a livelihood. And we're seeing right around the world that the demand for these things is just not quite where governments really want it to be. So what is their response? They're trying to put up more and more taxes, like this government is, on those cars that people want to buy, to try and force you to buy the ones that people often don't want to buy.
Makes sense. I want to ask you about the appalling violence we're seeing in Alice Springs. I think Australians would be absolutely shocked by the scenes there. What do you make of the calls for the feds to come in and take over to help try to restore order? And if that is to happen, can we expect the Prime Minister to actually spend some time in Alice Springs and then see for himself just what people there are living with day to day?
Well, I might start on the latter point first. Well, obviously the Prime Minister should be going to Alice Springs ASAP. I don't think he's been there since a very short visit, I think in between going to the Australian Open on multiple days more than a year ago now. And really he should be going there because it's just so shocking and sad what's happening into a major iconic spot of our nation. Now, this violence obviously has been out of control for well over a year now, and it's been on the front page of our national papers for that time. Clearly, the Northern Territory government is not capable of maintaining law and order in this city, and it is time for the federal government to step up here and offer all types of assistance it can do. It's obviously got its own police forces and resources it can provide. The local police there in the Northern Territory said they do not have the resources to maintain the safety of people overnight in Alice Springs. So why isn't the federal government offering to help here? And even if we have to, send in the military to get law and order going here, because no Australian should have to live with the kind of fear that those in Alice Springs have to live through right now. And that's white and black Australians alone. I mean, it's all Australians living there are doing it tough right now, and all Australians should be willing to help to try and make sure their safety is assured.
Well, this violence, we're just going to play a bit of footage, Matt. It is distressing footage for a Sunday morning, so look away. But this is Alice Springs. Have a look. So obviously it's blurred, but James, some horrific violence there.
Absolutely horrific. But I want to ask Matt, though, about another issue, though, digital IDs, and that legislation has now cleared the Senate. Given everything that we know about the possibilities of these things to be misused, the way that things that start out as sort of convenience things and, oh, you won't have to show your paperwork for this or that, and everything we went through during the pandemic, the potential for this to really limit people's freedoms and to be tracked everywhere they go. We know with metadata, they started talking about, child exploitation material and stopping drug smugglers. And it actually, I think, even wound up being used by a local council to catch somebody recycling wrong. How do we know that this is not going to be misused? And why is the coalition seemingly going along with this imposition that could see every single transaction you make tracked or limited depending on what the policies or the panic of the day is?
Well, just to make sure we're right there, James, the coalition voted against the digital ID laws.
Good, well done.
Good.
Excellent.
On Thursday, one of the few parties that did, along with One Nation and Ralph Babette of the Palmer Party. I think that were the only ones that were opposed. What was most shocking here is that the government rammed this through without any debate. There was zero debate on that bill. No second reading speeches, no ability to ask the minister questions as there normally would be through a legislative process, and no ability to discuss and debate the amendments, many amendments that were put to the bill. Now, I myself, I was on the committee that looked at this bill. I'd worked with Paul Fletcher, the Shadow Minister, to develop 4 amendments from the coalition that would at least help strengthen these laws, and one which would delay them, which I'll come back to. But there was no debate about that. So these laws, the government says they're voluntary, but there's actually very wide exceptions in place that allow companies to move away from the voluntary requirements and effectively make it mandatory for you to get a digital ID, potentially to open a bank account or interact with state government services. The government even refused to remove state governments from the ability to get exemptions. The coalition and I also wanted to see these changes held up until we see the related changes to the Privacy Act. We've obviously got this surveillance state coming through the widespread use of cameras and facial recognition, AI technology, and there is meant to be some changes to the Privacy Act to make sure your face and the data around that face is protected within the Act. It needs to be updated. And a lot of groups, civil liberty groups, some of which I normally wouldn't support, but did want to see those reforms done first before we allow private businesses to expand their use of digital IDs. And the government's refused to contemplate even those amendments. It's rushing ahead with these digital ID changes. And as you say, you've got to ask why. What's the mad rush here to allow private companies to surveil you more and potentially misuse your data to help grow their profits?
More secrecy, more authoritarianism. It's disgusting what this communist sympathising government are doing, in my opinion. But Albo's great idea is lots of solar panels, because we need lots of solar panels. We're going to be the great solar panel providers of the world, even though China, of course, already have that market stitched up. We have, you reckon, a glut of solar panels. Tell us about that and this quest for net zero emissions.
Well, look, it's been common knowledge for the last few months that there is a total glut of solar panels out in the world. China's trying to double its solar production capacity right now and dumping a huge amount of solar panels. Just overnight, we saw European solar panel manufacturers approach the European government to seek assistance and support to help them survive given this glut. And then so instead of learning from those lessons in countries in Europe, the federal government's just throwing $1 billion at this. And worse, they don't even have really a plan. There's no specific idea about which part of the solar production chain we are going to be able to specialise in, keeping in mind this really is a mass production process and it's not really Australia's comparative advantage, but it's not even clear what's going to happen here. This is just a total thought bubble from the government, wasting another $1 billion of your money chasing this fantasy that somehow we'll get back to sort of a production line facility in Australia. And meanwhile, the worst of all this is they're talking up this so-called transition and the need to go to net zero, when meanwhile the rest of the world is buying more and more coal. We had a record amount of coal used last year, and they're lying to the people of the Hunter region, telling them that your jobs aren't going to exist in the future when there's never been bigger demand for the product of the coal miners in the Hunter region. If they actually backed those workers like the Labor Party used to do, they'd be trying to develop those markets and secure their jobs and make sure that Australian coal is used ahead of Chinese or Indonesian or Indian coal, given the massive increasing demand we're seeing for coal right around the world.
Senator Matt Canavan, always fantastic to chat to you. Thanks for taking time off there at the Rocky Nats. Have a great day. Have a very happy Easter, Matt, to you and your family. And we'll speak again soon. Coming up, Rita's reality check. Plus, we've got John Campbell. Lots happening here on Outsiders Easter Sunday special.
Welcome back. You're watching Outsiders with your hosts, Rowan Dean, James Morrow, and I'm Rita Panahi. Coming up, we have wacky antics from the world of academia and the latest in lefty lunacy. And talking about lefty lunacy, take a look at devout Catholic Joe Biden declaring Easter Sunday, the day many consider the most important in the Christian calendar, to be a trans day of visibility. There's the White House statement, complete with the Easter Bunny in the White House logo, with the President declaring on Transgender Day visibility, we honour the extraordinary courage and contributions of transgender Americans. I am proud to have appointed transgender leaders to my administration. And he also said, I am proud to have signed historic executive orders that strengthen civil rights protections in housing, employment, health care, education, the justice system and more. Yes, those executive orders include on day one of Biden's failed presidency, attacking the rights of girls and women taking part in sporting competitions. As Abigail Schreier wrote in the Wall Street Journal, on day one, Mr. Biden placed all girls' sport and women's safe spaces in the crosshairs of the administrative state. An executive order rigs competition by requiring that biological boys be allowed to compete against girls. Biden's statement made further false claims about the epidemic of violence facing trans Americans, and he also said this about his Republican opponents. Extremists are proposing hundreds of hateful laws that target and terrify transgender kids and their families, silencing teachers, banning books, and even threatening parents, doctors and nurses with prison for helping parents get care for their children. No. Books depicting graphic sex scenes, so graphic that I can't even mention them or read any passages on this program, have rightfully been removed from school libraries. Activist teachers who want to indoctrinate children with a hard left radical gender politics have been told to stick to the curriculum. And as for threatening parents, doctors and nurses, well, those who abdicate their responsibilities and give powerful drugs, hormones to confuse children, and even perform irreversible surgeries on vulnerable teenagers as young as 13, and we're talking here about things like double mastectomies, they've been stopped from damaging the bodies of those confused kids. It's just saw a shot of Chloe Cole there. I spoke to her on this network. She was given a double mastectomy at 15. She lives with that devastating regret every day. Now, I guess Biden thinks the entire United Kingdom is full of extremist haters because they've just banned puberty blockers for under 18s, just like a number of US states led by Republican governors. And the question must be asked, do we really need a Trans Day of Visibility? Is this disproportionately powerful lobby not sufficiently visible the other 364 days? Is there some period throughout the year where this movement is suppressed in the West? And objecting to the very political branding of this movement can be called a hate crime. In New Zealand, police have just launched an investigation after a rainbow crossing in Auckland was painted over. They are calling this incident a hate crime and have vowed to bring the 3 offenders to justice. Of course, we do not condone any sort of vandalism here, but I do wonder whether the men there are just equine enthusiasts who were concerned that horses would be spooked by the rainbow crossing. Remember this?
Mounted police force. Oh, I don't like the colour. Don't like the colour. Oh, brilliant, brilliant.
Those horses were found guilty of hate crimes and immediately put down, of course. Before Paul Barry has a meltdown, that was a joke, folks. And talking about droll commentary, let's check in with the latest from satirical cartoon series Please Explain.
Dear Diary, it's been 3 weeks since we crash landed on this tropical island in Adam Band's private jet, and our little society is thriving. We've got an abundance of coconuts, the economy was booming and things couldn't be better, but there was just one little thing missing. What we needed was the government. And wouldn't you believe it, I won with just 33% of the vote. And of course my first move as leader was to install these beautiful wind turbines to help us achieve net zero. But the sound of sustainable energy attracted the attention of the natives. So as leader, I did what I do best. I grovelled. Oh, I feel so guilty about colonising the island. I'm sorry, I'll do anything to repay you, please. So we apologised on behalf of the entire island. We stopped people from climbing their big cool rock, and we shared with them hundreds of our coconuts so they could give them out to the other natives. We had so many really important things to do, but we needed a lot more coconuts than we had at the time. So facing a huge problem, I did what I always do. I jumped on a raft and went on a holiday and visited a bunch of other islands. But that's when I got a real smart idea. I brought in all these immigrants from other islands to help us pick more coconuts. And even though we didn't have enough huts for all these new people, all I had to do was go and get more immigrants to help build more huts. There were problems everywhere. And all I could do was pour coconuts on them to make them go away. But then the great coconut recession hit, and there weren't enough coconuts to go around. But that didn't matter to me. I was more concerned about how the natives felt instead. I sat with them in the dirt and I cried with them. And even though we'd changed the names of everything, welcome to Pudu! And we were doing these welcome to island ceremonies all day and night, and giving out 30 billion coconuts a year. And somehow that wasn't even making it to the natives that needed it most. So the best thing I could do was give them an advisory panel called The Voice 2. And this time there was no way I was going to hold a referendum. I just decided to change the island constitution all by myself. What could go wrong? And now we're on a raft in the middle of the ocean.
Thanks, Rita, and great stuff there from Pauline. Pauline Hanson's One Nation and James Ashby do a great job there with the cartoons. Well, you will remember COVID. Who can forget it? I keep calling for a royal commission into the abuse of power during COVID. You'll remember during COVID that this show, pretty much ahead of every other show in Australia, was critical of the vaccine mandates, was critical of mask mandates, was critical of the lockdowns, etc., etc. Rita and I, for our troubles, were defamed in the Australian Senate by the usual suspects simply for attempting to bring you our version of what we thought was actually going on. Someone else who many, many people around the world looked to for news on COVID was John Campbell. He has 3 million subscribers on his YouTube channel, and over 750 million people have sought out his views on everything on COVID, from those original lockdowns through to mandates. He was been a controversial character. Some said that he was calm and measured. That was his approach. Others, of course, have accused him of all sorts of conspiracy theories, etc., etc. Whatever, you judge for yourself. Joining us now in the studio is John Campbell. John, delighted to have you here. Welcome to Australia.
Thank you very much.
You've arrived at a great time of year, so I hope you're enjoying it. Now, I keep calling for a royal commission into the abuse of power during COVID. Were you to be part of that royal commission, were you to present yourself into a royal commission in Australia, what would you be saying?
I think I would want to look at what has happened in objective terms and try and compare that to known scientific principles. Because we know quite a lot of the science here. We know a lot of the basic epidemiology. We know a lot from talking to experts around the world. Our own Professor Clancy, for example, who tells us all about the immunology and the way that the viruses interact with the body and how respiratory viruses spread. We need to apply that science to what has happened. And when we do that, retrospectively, we'll see that there's a lot of contradictions, I believe, with the basic science. Now, at the time, this was difficult to assess, because we had these authority figures in my country, the chief medical officer, the prime minister, the chief scientific officer, telling us, well, this is how it is. And because as a healthcare professional, I've followed guidelines all my life, we have to do that in healthcare, otherwise you'd get into trouble probably fairly quickly. It was really hard to go against this authority figures. But because we now believe that the science contradicts what these authority figures told us, I really feel in the United Kingdom it's another end of the age of deference, and I think we're getting that same thing here.
So give us some examples. I mean, we've cited many here on this show of where we said X and Y at the time. We were accused of being conspiracy theorists. We were shouted down. We had all sorts of threats against us. Fast forward for a couple of years, and it's commonly accepted. Did you have similar experiences to that?
We did. There's a lot of examples. What lockdowns would do, for example, is postpone the inevitable. You can't stop a respiratory virus. It's going to go everywhere. I've done interviews with people of the calibre of Dr. Claire Craig, for example, and she tells us about the aerosolisation of the viruses, that you really can't stop it. So lockdowns can postpone it, can kind of kick it into the long grass for a period of time, but they're never going to stop it. It's inevitable that everyone's going to be exposed to this. Mask wearing is the same. I mean, if someone's actually coughing and spluttering huge amounts of liquid material, or
Sunday morning, John,
all over the place, then OK, that there's some minimal benefit. But the idea that you can stop these aerosolised viruses getting into the environment is just really quite ridiculous. And again, it's comparing the evidence with what actually happened. I think that's the key thing to go forward. And again, the prophylactic measures that were taken. The prophylactic measures, they can stop you getting very sick for a short period of time, but they're not really going to stop the spread because they work systemically, whereas the virus is aerosolised. It's in the airways.
Yeah.
A lot of contradictions, really.
Who bears the most responsibility? Obviously, we've got the health bureaucrats who took a particular line in most countries. But we also had the media, which was complicit. I know BBC's just in the past week's been accused of just gross scaremongering to try to back up that lockdown strategies. Who do you see as the people who need to take accountability for what we saw?
Yeah. Strangely enough, some of the politicians are maybe less culpable than you might think because they were advised by senior scientific advisors. And, the politicians will openly admit that they're not scientists. But I think politicians should have been much more analytical, much more questioning, much more, what is the counter-narrative here? OK, you've given me this argument, Chief Medical Officer. Let's have some counter-argument to this. Let's come to some kind of synthesis position. But those in authority, I think, really have got some quite serious questions to answer. And what is concerning is compromise or potential compromise or apparent compromise of our regulatory bodies. TGA, for example, receives a lot of its funding, well over 90%, from industry.
TGA is the Australian Therapeutics and Goods Administration, and Britain has a similar body.
And the same, Medicines and Healthcare Regulatory Agency. Again, I think it was 86% in the last data I had was industry funded. How can these regulatory bodies be giving impartial, independent advice? Because we all know the old saying, he who pays the fiddler has no say whatsoever in the tune.
James.
Well, John, I want to ask you, you said a moment ago, we have to ask why people in authority sort of did all these different things and, went down this route. The question, though, that I have is, in Australia, for example, we had detailed pandemic plans sitting on the shelf, and I presume in Britain and other countries had the same thing. Tony Abbott, our former Prime Minister, had been health minister and worked on these, and these said, you don't close schools, you don't do this, you don't do that, you don't do basically everything we did. In April 2020, I wrote about The Lancet, which had done a big study off of SARS and said you don't close schools. Now, finally, 4 years later, everyone's saying, oh gosh, this is really screwed with kids' education in all sorts of horrible ways. I'm sure you've seen the same thing. Why is it, do you think, that people in authority ignored all of the work that they'd done in advance to prepare for precisely this eventuality and said, nope, we're going to do this, we're going to make it up as we go along, and we're going to go down the most authoritarian path possible?
You know, you're absolutely right. I've been teaching my students for 20, 30 years now. Another pandemic is going to be coming. OK, we thought it might be influenza. It turns out to be coronavirus. But we knew another pandemic was coming. That was inevitable. And as you rightly say, governments had detailed plans of how this would be done. We learned, as you say, from the SARS coronavirus 1 epidemic, 2000 and 2003. A lot was learned from that and other epidemics over the years. The plans were there in detail. But when it actually happened, to a large extent, they seem to be basically ignored. And scientists, medical advisors, governments around the world seem to go into some kind of panic mode, really. So why they ignored the detailed planning, and I think ignored is a reasonable word to use there, I think that's a really good question for these guys. You know, we had these contingencies worked out by experts over decades. Why were these ignored? Was it panic? And questions should be asked. Was it vested interest?
Well, weren't they just following the World Health Authority, who was following China? The World Health Organization said lockdowns are working in China, so everyone else. How important is Sweden in that equation? Because they're really one of the few places that went against this. And states like Florida and Texas as well. So what have we learnt from their approach compared to what we did here in Australia, UK, US?
It's interesting. In psychiatry, there's a concept called folie à deux, follow after you, where someone adopts abnormal psychiatric behaviour. And that's what seems to have happened on the international stage. You know,
Indeed.
Did the Australia lock down because the UK locked down, or were we looking at you guys and thought, oh, they've done it, we better do it? And every country seemed to go the same way, except Sweden, as you say, a notable example. They gave recommendations to their citizens. They didn't use it as an opportunity to seize power. They said, look, this is what we recommend. And strangely enough, most people were quite sensible and did what was recommended. They actually followed the guidelines really, really quite well.
So what is the lesson, I guess? Next time, we keep being told, oh, another pandemic is going to come around. But what will happen next time? Has government bodies and governments and institutions, have they been tarnished by this? I mean, the fact that your YouTube, 750 million views, as I say, you've been teaching on YouTube about various medical things for many, many years. But was there a hunger for people to, and this is certainly our experience on this show, there was a hunger to get information that maybe ran against the narrative, because people in a democracy are supposed to be able to make up their own minds about these things. So what's going to happen next time? Do you think the authorities will clamp down harder? The World Health Organization keeps saying, oh, there's going to be disease X or whatever. But what does happen? Or are people going to be so burnt and bruised by the COVID experience that they're going to say, no, this ain't happening again? And that could equally be counterproductive with people ignoring any legitimate advice, for example. What do you think?
I agree with those points. It's really quite sad that so many people tune into me, because there's kind of a need for that. People want that reassurance. This information should be coming from the authorities, people that we can trust. And there's no question in my mind, there's a massive loss of trust. I feel this talking to people I know, even talking to people here, but certainly comments from around the world, there's a great lack of trust. So who do we look to? Because there is going to be another pandemic. Now, where that pandemic comes from is an interesting question. If people are still doing various types of virological research in various laboratories around the world, funded by various people around the world, in laboratories that are somewhat leaky, then I'm afraid another pandemic is inevitable. Whether it's a natural zoonotic one or whether it's a human assisted one, shall we say. So this is going to happen. This is inevitable. And when it does happen, it's possible that there's a new virus which is much more lethal. It really is possible that we could have a virus which, kills 50% or more of people that are affected, Ebola, and we have these viruses that are there. If they became more transmissible, it is a big concern. Who do we look to? Well, do we look to the World Health Organization? Well, again, that's been greatly compromised. We know there's personal vested interest in that. We know that there's apparent
and they're
political
trying to seize more power with this global pandemic treaty. What do you make of that?
Massive. I've been talking to James Roguski in the States about this, who's been following it through, and various other people. And power grab is the term that I would personally use.
Yep.
They are trying to assume power. They're trying to centralise power. The whole point about a pandemic is you need a localised response. Local doctors know what's best for their people. Local administrators, hopefully, would know what's best for their people. And the idea that the World Health Organization can impose a one-size-fits-all, to me, just seems quite ludicrous. And potentially impose treatments that could have, as I read these things, the authority of the nation state to enforce it.
Yeah.
So we do have the risk of internationalised totalitarian response. And if a new pandemic happened now, with the flow of information that we will get, it would be very difficult for people like me to adjudicate exactly how serious the risk is. Because if the World Health Organization says there's a serious risk and this works and that doesn't, then based on previous evidence, I think we'd have to interrogate that quite clearly before we applied it to ourselves and our loved ones.
John Campbell, you've got millions of people watching you around the world. So great to have you here on Outsiders this morning. Enjoy Australia. Great to chat to you, and keep up the great work.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.
Great. Coming up, lots more. We've got Robert Milner who's going to talk about Nature Positive Plan. Lots more on Outsiders coming up in a tick. Yes, instant karma has hit the Sydney Theatre Company, all right. This is the mob who went around getting up on stage, pro-Palestinian, straight after October 7th. Unbelievable stuff. Well, one by one, people have walked away from the Sydney Theatre Company. You've had donors saying, forget this is not on. Gretel Packer, congratulations to Gretel Packer for also saying, no thanks, not interested in this bunch of clowns, James.
Well, yeah, and you've got not only that, reports that the fallout from this has meant that there could be as many as 15 to 20 positions at the Sydney Theatre Company that are going to be made redundant. Already 7 or 8 have been identified for the acts. This is, of course, terrible news. And, you know, I just wish that all of these arts organizations could simply stay out of politics. If you want to do a play that's political, that's fine. But, gee, what are they thinking? Getting up there, putting on their keffiyehs, doing the whole cosplay routine. I just don't get what they are doing. It always ends in tears. And, you know, the arts are hard enough to keep going in this country as it is. These people who are going to lose their jobs, and I hope the actors who did that are among them, you know, they're going to have a very hard time finding more work in this field.
Go woke, go broke.
Go broke.
And this is a broader problem. I know this was an anti-Israel protest, but the arts in this country, if they actually do want to appeal to the wider community, the entire community, not just, say, the 10% who vote for the Greens or the 30% who might be rusted on Labor, then they need to actually produce content that has got broader appeal. I'm not talking about... I'm talking about stripping out that political ideology that is often so vapid and boring anyway.
And you know what you see?
Exactly.
Unwatchable.
You know what you see so often with these things, and I mean, the Sydney Theatre Company has been guilty of it, but a lot of other sort of companies have been guilty of this same thing. You know, they're going to go and they're going to take Othello, but give it a trans angle, or they're going to take this, and you know, trying to force these sort of modern, woke, transgressive politics on the classics, because, of course, the classics aren't transgressive enough, but they're classics, guys, for a reason. People want to see them. And you know what? They'll pay you money if you do it.
And half the country that considers itself conservative or centre-right, even if it's 40% of the country, you're missing out on that market. That is a market that is wanting this sort of content, but... You know, if you go along and pay good money and you get some stupid political lecture, you're probably not going to go back for a second time or a third time. So they really are damaging themselves. And this is just another example.
And Woolworths too are determined. Woolworths are determined to go broke. They're determined to live that out. They'll find a cause, Anzac Day, so they've got the Anzac Day bickies from the RSL. Oh, no, we're not going to stock those ones like they didn't do the Australia Day thing. They are determined, Woolworths, so let's make sure that they get the message, because it's obviously not getting through. Stop shopping at Woolworths till they stop being political. Pretty simple message, Woolworths.
I thought with Brad departing the scene...
Oh, they haven't got any, but they still refuse to learn. There you go. What can you say? Let's now go to the insane world of net zero policies with Net Zany. Well, there have been hailstones all around Texas, which have been destroying all the solar panels. Who'd have thought, Rita? Do we have hail in Australia, Rita?
No, I just can't wait for this to happen here. And everyone being shocked. What, hailstones? They don't interact well with solar panels? Who could have imagined that?
Who'd have
imagined that?
All this...
Look at that. It's a bit of damage.
Unbelievable. They're destroyed, and there'll be more and more land waste. The whole climate change fandango. Seriously, great news for Chinese businessmen. That's about it. We'll take a short break. Back more. Lots more happening here on Outsiders. Happy Easter. You're watching Outsiders with Rita Panahi, James Morrow, and myself, Rowan Dean. The story of Easter is one of the foundational stories of our Judeo-Christian culture, both for better and for worse. I'm not a theologian, but the overlap between Passover and Easter is self-evident. Both the stories of hope and salvation, both times when God apparently spoke to his people. The crucifixion itself has cast a long and terrible shadow over Christians' treatment of the Jews down through the ages. But the concepts of forgiveness and of rebirth and of overcoming adversity are fundamental to Western civilization. The ideas of spiritual rebirth and the celebration of life over death also manifests itself in the Anglo-Saxon pagan symbols we see echoed in Easter. The date of Easter itself is linked to the lunar cycle, and there are, of course, all the springtime symbols of fertility, chocolate rabbits and eggs galore. Easter eggs, please note, and Easter bunnies, not gesture eggs, not gesture bunnies. Easter is also known as Pascha in Orthodox denominations, or in French as Pâques, both words derived from the Jewish Passover. More than any other time of the year, including Christmas, Easter and Passover, are the source of much Western art, literature, storytelling, culture and history. The Last Supper by Leonardo da Vinci, for example, is not only a magnificent painting, it also depicts Jesus and his disciples celebrating during Passover shortly before he was taken to his crucifixion, with the meal itself being the basis of the Holy Communion. Radical climate activists have already attempted to destroy da Vinci's other great work of art, the Mona Lisa, in a moronic effort to save the planet and to stop the oceans from rising. Art, culture, history, literature, religion, all are intertwined. We destroy them at our peril, and we weaken the links between them at our peril. George Clooney pointed this out in his 2014 movie Monument Men, about a group of Allied soldiers sent in to retrieve precious cultural artefacts before the Nazis seize or destroy them.
Culture and for our way of life. You can wipe out a generation of people, you can burn their homes to the ground, and somehow they'll still come back. But if you destroy their achievements and their history, then it's like they never existed.
How ironic then that today we in the West seem hell-bent on wiping out our own history, our own culture. Radical activists and brainwashed students tear down statues, desecrate monuments, screech about colonialism and racism and First Nations in the same breath as calling for the eviction of the Jewish people from their own First Nation, Israel. A pernicious, determined and sinister cultural onslaught has been launched against the West, and every single day we are presented with yet another field of destruction, of emblems and symbols razed to the ground. This week we learned Woolies are continuing their assault on our traditions by discontinuing certain Anzac biscuit tins. Yes, let's forget about the achievements of the Anzac, shall we? Just like the same people would obliterate Australia Day and thereby eradicate all the great achievements of this settler nation. Yet if we dare raise our voices to object to this wiping of our history and traditions, we are the ones waging a culture war. No, we are the ones defending our culture because our political leaders, with only a very few and noble exceptions, are too cowardly to fight on our behalf to preserve the achievements of our culture. As much as the history of Christianity and the West are intertwined, so too is the history of Israel and Judaism, intertwined with Western Enlightenment. Destroy one, you destroy the other. This church, one of the largest in Africa, was torched recently, bombed and burned by the Sudanese armed forces run by the Muslim Brotherhood. Did you read about it in the news? Did they mention it on the ABC? Churches are burnt down, sold off, or left to rot all across Europe. Does anybody care? Apparently not. This week, the Archbishop of Canterbury saw fit to fly the flag of Pakistan with its overt Islamic symbols in celebration of the Pakistani High Commissioner being represented at Evensong on Pakistan's National Day. Westminster Abbey, no less. Seen here, depicted on the Bayeux tapestry at the time of Edward the Confessor, is not only at the very heart of the Anglican Church, it's where more than 40 kings and queens have been crowned, and it is also the burial home of literally thousands of our culture's greatest artists, writers and thinkers, everyone from William Wordsworth to Laurence Olivier. Understandably, some people were a little bit upset by the symbolism, especially because just around the corner in London is Regent Street, long known, of course, for its celebration of Christmas every year with its Christmas lights. But this week, the hard-left Muslim mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, decided it was time not for Easter lights, but for Ramadan lights. So is this a celebration of the success of Britain's much-touted multiculturalism? In which case, where were the similar festivities paid for by the British taxpayer for all the other religions, and indeed for Easter and for Passover? Along with gesture eggs, it would appear that there are those who wish to erase all celebration of our Christian and Jewish heritages from Western culture. And in a couple of months' time, Regent Street will yet again devote itself for the better part of the entire British summer to an overt celebration of transgenderism and queer culture. Who knows, perhaps Queers for Palestine might put in an appearance during this year's Pride marches. Interestingly, after some Conservatives kicked up a fuss online, Westminster City Hall apparently panicked and quickly put up some Easter signage along with the Ramadan signage. You see, folks, fighting the culture wars can bear fruit. Culture operates at many levels, and I was also reminded this week of a famous ad from the 1970s or 80s. It was an ad about a clash of cultures, about a posh, highly educated young Englishman attempting to seduce an attractive young working-class girl from southeast London. For her, the heart of her culture was not Shakespeare or Yeats, but...
It's very odd. I don't even know your name, but after this one Campari and soda, I feel I almost know you. May I freshen your glass? Soda, of course.
No, lemonade.
Campari and lemonade.
Yes, nice colour, isn't it?
Campari, with soda, with lemonade, with tonic, but always with pleasure.
Were you truly wafted here from paradise?
No, Luton Airport.
Nah, Luton Airport became a catchphrase for the new upwardly mobile working classes who did so well during the Thatcher years of aspiration and conservative values. I was reminded of the ad because this week Luton Council, home presumably to Luton Airport, decided to proudly fly the Palestinian flag. Remember, the UK does not recognise any such nation as Palestine, nor does Australia, nor for that matter, does the United States of America. Lorraine Chase was the young woman's name in that ad, and the ad made her a cultural celebrity, a household name in Britain. Perhaps Campari could remake their ad with a contemporary cultural twist. Were you truly wafted here from paradise? Nah, from occupied Palestine, from the river to the sea. Not content with the Palestinian flag flying over Luton Council chambers, a group of demonstrators decided to harass Londoners in a local Tesco shop. Elsewhere, pro-Palestinian Londoners were busy chanting for an intifada, which is, of course, a call to commit violence against the Jews of Israel.
Intifada! 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 Intifada!
Not entirely surprisingly, Israeli Minister Amichai Chikli this week labelled London as the most anti-Semitic city in the West. But here in Australia, we weren't far behind with the news that the Melbourne-based online retailer Redbubble is selling disgustingly anti-Semitic T-shirts and slogans. Those idiotic kids should be ashamed of themselves, but they are, of course, free to peacefully protest in whatever manner they see fit, so long as they are not inciting violence, thanks entirely to our Western culture. Generations of often religious, God-fearing people, including our grandparents and their parents' generations, gave their lives to protect these freedoms. Yet apparently their Anzac Bickies tins aren't worth celebrating. But again, how do we combine our Western values of freedom of expression and freedom of religion with the multicultural doctrine of different cultures coexisting, when at the heart of certain cultures is the avowed destruction of the existing democratic values of the West? Tricky one, eh? It was Ronald Reagan who said freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it to our children in their bloodstream, he said. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. And it was Margaret Thatcher who pointed out that nowadays socialism is often dressed up as environmentalism, feminism, or human rights. She would no doubt add transgenderism and wokeism to that list. All sound good, she said, in the abstract. But scratch the surface and you find socialism, anti-capitalism, quotas, attacks on democracy, authoritarianism. The simple fact is that our Western culture is under assault from a wide array of foes, all of whom have one goal, and all of whom are instantly recognisable by that one core goal, and that goal is the destruction of individual freedom and liberty as we know it, and its replacement with a new creed, a creed that includes hatred of Christianity, hatred of Israel and the Jews, and hatred of all Western achievements. The goal is the obliteration of all three. I would argue that those goals, intentionally or unintentionally, are common to the pro-Palestinian movement, the militant transgender movement, the extremist climate change cult, the militant First Nations movement around the world, and the doctrine of critical race theory that permeates all aspects of our children's education these days. And what do all these institutions or ideologies have in common? Why, they are all, yes, every one of them, supported to one degree or another by the modern left. In fact, they even have a label, woke. I argue and have argued for many years on this show that the modern left and wokeness, either through ideology, ignorance, or incompetence, is fundamentally incompatible with our traditional Judeo-Christian values. And I'm not alone. Here's the great hero of the Democrats, yes, of the Democrats, lawyer Alan Dershowitz, this week declaring why he may no longer vote for the Democrats.
Biden has turned against Israel, not against Netanyahu, against Israel. And that's why in this election, more than any election, I've been voting Democrat, for example, since 1960 for John Kennedy. This is the first election I have ever considered not voting for a Democrat.
And those of you who voted for Labour or the Teals or the Greens should be thinking exactly the same. Here's George Bush this week on the conflict in Israel.
They're not going to negotiate. These people have played their cards. They want to kill as many Israelis as they can, and negotiating with killers is not an option for the elected government of Israel. And so we're just going to have to remain steadfast. But it's not going to take long. It's gone on too long. Surely there's a way to settle this through negotiations. Both sides are guilty. My view is one side is guilty, and it's not Israel.
Well said, George Bush. And here's Noah Tishby, a good friend of this show, earlier this week.
I am done with people not believing the hostages and the survivors. I'm done with it. It's not just anti-Semitic by now. It's simply inhumane. Israel has to do whatever it can to make sure that Hamas is defeated and that this doesn't happen again.
Hear, hear. But I want to leave the final word to Democrat Congresswoman Alexandra Ocasio-Cortez. In my opinion, whether it's Israel, climate, gender, race, diversity, equity, inclusion, or any other woke so-called culture war issues, the left approaches it solely through its putrid ideology born of ignorance and hatred of traditional Western achievements and institutions that have given us all so much. And that is what makes the modern left so dangerous.
You use the term the occupation of Palestine. What did you mean by that?
I think what I meant is like the settlements that are increasing in some of these areas and places where Palestinians are experiencing difficulty in access to their housing and homes.
Do you think you can expand on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd also just, I am not the expert on geopolitics on this issue.
Indeed, young lady, you are not, and yet you wish to change the world. This is why we must preserve our heritage, our culture, and our traditions, so that decency survives and ignorance is defeated. Please, this Easter, speak up, take the lesson of Easter, and put your every effort into a rebirth of Western culture, Judeo-Christian values, and Enlightenment achievements. Yes, we are in a culture war. And for the sake of all those Aussie kids hunting for their Easter eggs today, we better win it. Joining us now to discuss the very real impact that Labor's secretive nature-positive plan and laws are having on business is Robert Milner, the chairman of Soul Pattinson, and one of our most successful entrepreneurs. Robert, great to have you here on Outsiders. You had a great article in the Financial Review this week. You've been speaking out against your fear about this secretive nature-positive plan. You yourself have had many projects that have suffered through endless red tape, green tape, all this sort of stuff. What's your warning to Australian businesses, Robert?
Well, good morning, all. I don't think people quite realise how dramatic this potential environmental laws, if they come into fruition, will be. And the most disappointing part of it is that it's completely surrounded in secrecy. No one's been asked to consult or add their views to this. And I think the other most important part about this is if this does go ahead, I think it's going to affect all Australians. And if you start talking politics, it's going to affect both Liberal and Labor politics, because various electorates are going to be affected by this. And surely there's going to be a massive loss of jobs going forward. So that's going to have a massive effect on the whole of the country. If we can't transform from the cheap energy that we've had over decades in oil, gas and petroleum into things like lithium and cobalt and copper, all these take 5 to 7 years to start up a mine. So you can't get approvals now. So they bring these laws in that are going to make it even harder. Where do we go?
James.
Well, I'm wondering if, Robert, part of the reason for some of the secrecy and lack of transparency around this is that there is also a global nature-positive initiative that has ties to the United Nations, to Davos, to the World Economic Forum, the Rockefeller Trust, and things of that nature. Should we be concerned that this is actually a global initiative being pushed by global governance groups without regard for the Australian democracy and what actual people on the ground here want?
Yeah, it's obvious. The world has been so, as I mentioned in that article, the world has been so successful over the period of time because we've had cheap energy. The world has cheap energy, and this at the moment, why are we in Australia paying 30 or 40% more for our energy than what we should be? We've got the cheapest energy in the world here. We're paying 30 or 40% more for it.
Well, yeah, that's we're sitting on what, hundreds of years possibly of gas reserves, and we're not doing any gas exploration. We've got a shortage. Is this entire plan just another layer of bureaucracy to frustrate development? What are you seeing as the main danger of this legislation?
As you mentioned, it's going to delay things further, and it's going to start, for example, with property developers. We can't build now enough homes. So if you're going to have legislation brought in on top of property developers to open up new areas for land, it's going to have a massive effect on agriculture. And as I've mentioned before, we're already having this massive delays in getting any approved for future mining. We've been involved in a coal asset in around Ackland near Toowoomba, and it's taken us 12 years to get a reapproval. 12 years.
And Robert, what's the impact? You've done many businesses, being the CEO and on the board of many successful Australian businesses. What do you fear for the future of Australian business if Labor push ahead with this secret plan? What are the dangers to Australian businesses?
Well, obviously, it's getting approvals. And I go back again, 20 or 30 years ago, a builder could go into a local council on a Monday morning and put your plans in for a new house, and you'd go and pick them up on the Thursday or Friday. Now it's 8 or 10 months in some shires to get an approval to develop a new house. So we've just been slowed down. Every part of our business that we're involved in, we do have problems with getting approvals in one way or another, whether it's mining or whether it's building or whatever it is. It's just the government is so anti-development.
Robert Milner, well, Australians should be listening to you. You've certainly been a success in business and industry. If you're worried about these nature-positive plans, then we all should be. Robert, have a very happy Easter. Thanks so much for coming on Outsiders. Thanks, Robert.
All right, thank you very much. Enjoy your day.
You too. Thanks, mate. Coming up, lots more. James's donkey vote in a tick, and we'll chat to Ben Hood about this idiotic South Australian voice that went ahead this week. In a tick.
Hello, you're watching Outsiders. I'm James Morrow, here at the desk as always with Rita Panahi and Rowan Dean. Well, the full difference between the presidential campaigns of Joe Biden and Donald Trump were on full display this weekend. In Manhattan, we saw Joe Biden being upstaged by not one, but two former presidents, Bill Clinton and Barack Obama. Seriously, what is with their no-tie look, by the way? They look like a bunch of furniture salesmen or members of the Iranian parliament or something. But meanwhile, on a more serious note, out in the suburbs, Donald Trump took the time to go to the wake of a slain NYPD officer who was allegedly killed by a career criminal and who was laid to rest in a moving ceremony attended by thousands and thousands and thousands of his fellow cops just hours ago. But as so often is the case with these sorts of things, it wasn't what happened inside the two events that was really telling. What was telling was what happened outside them. You see, while Democrats partied and handed over as much as $100,000 for the chance to take a selfie with the three current and former presidents inside Radio City Music Hall, outside it was a different story. The pro-Palestinian wing of the left took to the streets in their numbers to protest the event because apparently the Biden White House doesn't hate Israel enough for their liking. This led to some ugly scenes, such as this violent confrontation between police and protesters. Here's a sample.
We're escalating. We're on the sidewalk. We're on the sidewalk. Wheelchair!
The pro-Palestinian side also stared down and taunted the cops, chanting "oink, oink, piggy, piggy" at them. Classy. I I tell you what, the restraint of those cops in not tasing the absolute lot of them is admirable, though frankly also a bit of a shame. Now, it wasn't just cops who, well, copped it either. This man was trying to get through the protest to visit his dying mother, but it turns out these Palestinian sympathizers in New York have just as much respect for civilians as Hamas does overseas.
I'm going to my dying mother.
And indeed, the full anti-Semitism and woman hatred of some of those people on the left was on display as protesters harassed attendees of the Biden fundraiser.
They're getting raped right now! Die! Who's getting raped by the lies? Children were dying while you were sitting in there comfortable. Yeah, I love you.
You can fill in the bleeps yourself, but they were some of the filthiest and most horrible words that you could utter at a woman or a Jew as an epithet. And it didn't stop there either. These suburban keffiyeh-wearing cosplayers at the protest hate the whole damn United States of America.
Down with the USA! Down with the USA! Down with the USA! Down with the USA! Netanyahu, you will pay! Netanyahu, you will pay!
Didn't you love how that kid had to look at his phone to figure out what the next line in his idiotic, stupid chant was? Boy, they're not teaching the same sort of stuff at Columbia as they used to, are they? Anyway, some protesters even made it inside the hall, presumably after having brought a very expensive ticket first.
There was an insurrection happening.
Shame on you, Joe Biden! Shame on you! Shame on you! You are genocide of Palestine, and no amount of full concern that you do will change the billions that you are doing!
Meanwhile, on the other side of town, out in the suburbs, in fact, Donald Trump attended a very different, far more somber event. A wake in suburban Long Island for Jonathan Diller, a New York police officer who was allegedly killed in the line of duty by a career criminal during what should have been a routine traffic stop. Now, here's a bit of what Trump had to say.
They're not given the respect. The police are the greatest people we have. There's nothing and there's nobody like them, and this should never happen. I just visited with a very beautiful wife that now doesn't have her husband. Stephanie was just incredible. Their child, brand new, beautiful baby. And we have to stop it. We have to stop it. We have to get back to law and order. We have to do a lot of things differently because this is not working. This is happening too often.
The contrast between these two leaders led to this powerful New York Post front page, comparing and contrasting their two approaches. But again, it wasn't what happened inside the wake as what happened outside that was the most telling. What you're seeing now on your screen is vision of Democrat New York Governor Kathy Hochul leaving. Word is that she was asked to leave the wake for Officer Diller after just 10 minutes in attendance, and then being confronted by a man in a black suit who was cheered by police officers as the governor left to get in her car and go. Now, on Saturday, Officer Diller was remembered by his wife at his funeral, and she made a moving plea.
Now my son will grow up without his father, I will grow old without my husband, and his parents have to say goodbye to their child. How many more police officers and how many more families need to make the ultimate sacrifice before we start protecting them? I don't wish this kind of pain on anyone. Jonathan lived his life doing good for people, and it's now time for people to do good for all the officers he represents.
Now, again, the contrast between these two scenes. Think about it. On the one hand, You've got a doddering Biden being propped up by his predecessors to carve up donations from the rich and powerful, while the hard left screams Jew hatred on the streets outside. And on the other hand, you see a former and perhaps future president attending a wake for a slain officer and a Democrat governor being all but banished from the event. It's powerful and telling, and it looks to define the rest of the 2024 campaign.
Great stuff, James. I just disagree with the word potential. He will be the next president. Can't wait. Now, embarrassment for Labor as the South Australian government's decision to push ahead with a state-based voice. We all voted against the voice, but no, Labor, what's his name, thinks he knows better. It backfired. Just over 9% of Indigenous Australians in South Australia turned out to vote following a resounding no vote in the federal referendum. Joining us now to discuss this is South Australian Liberal member of the Legislative Council, Ben Hood. Ben, great to see you again. What is going on in South Australia? Please explain. We voted against the voice, but you then do a voice and nobody bothers to turn up. You know, it's what if they, the old saying used to be, what if they put up on a war and nobody came? Or what if they actually legislated a voice and nobody bothered to turn up? What's going on, Ben?
Well, you're spot on, Rowan, and happy Easter Sunday to all your viewers. Look, what has happened is probably what we expected. 64% of South Australians voted no to the federal referendum, and now 90% of Aboriginal South Australians have, for all intents and purposes, turned their back on this voice. It's a vote of no confidence. There was approximately 2,500 votes cast throughout the state, and some electors or some nominators were elected with less than 6 votes, and there are cases that some of them had 0 votes. So it begs the question: did they even come out and vote for themselves? It's it's an absolute travesty. It's a complete failure on every measure. And Peter Malinowskis needs to undo this straight away, no doubt about it.
Rita.
Wow. Yeah, well, it was reported there were reps elected with 6 votes, which is mind-blowing. But we've also seen this in Victoria. Now, Victoria had less than 10% turnout as well, 7%, and just under 10% for the last First People's Assembly, they call it in Victoria. But there seems to be no appetite to do a U-turn here. What will the Liberals, the coalition, do if they are elected? Do you have a firm policy to roll this back, or are we waiting and seeing what happens?
Look, it's a great question, Rita. And look, I've personally been against the federal vote and, of course, the state vote as well. And as long as I'm in the party room of the state Liberals, I'll be advocating for a repeal policy to be brought to 2026. But at the end of the day, we have a repeal bill being brought before the Legislative Council by the Honourable Sarah Game. I congratulate her on that. But it hasn't been brought to a vote because we don't have the numbers, quite simply. So it is up to Peter Malinowskis to pull the levers of government to undo what has essentially been a failed ideological experiment on behalf of Labor and put a line through this voice. Only yesterday, the Premier and Attorney General Kyan Ma equated this vote, this successful vote in their terms, to ATSI. And we know exactly how ATSI turned out. It was abolished because of corruption and nepotism. And I'm really worried, as are a majority of South Australians, I think, that that's exactly where this state voice is going to go as well.
James.
Well, Ben, tell me about, you've got a petition, don'tdividesa.com.au. Tell me how that's going, what that's calling for, and is it true that you've had more signatories to that petition than people actually cast their vote in this election?
Well, James, that's exactly right. Don't Divide SA is a petition that I spun up last November. To date, we've had over 7,000 votes or signs, a signatory on that petition. So that's about, well, I'm not very good at maths, but about 171% more than the people that actually voted in this state voice. And I think that outlines the issue here, that the Labor government in South Australia are ignoring the pleas of everyday South Australians. They're not focused on cost of living. They're not focused on dealing with the energy crisis. They're not focused on small business and backing the family, but chasing down every ideological rabbit hole with their pet causes. And unfortunately, they're the ones that have to undo this.
And Ben, sorry, just one more question for you. How much will this voice cost to operate, run, implement, and what actual authority does it have, if any, to influence legislation? Or is this just simply an expensive advisory body that has no power, or that it will have power and have real teeth despite having representatives voted onto it with tiny, less than a handful of votes?
Look, it's a great question, James. At the end of the day, Labor would have you believe both, that it's this powerful voice for Aboriginal Australians, or it's actually not anything really that terrible. What it is the voice can come onto the floor of Parliament and speak to any bill. The clerks of both houses have to advise the voice of any legislation, any bill that comes before Parliament. Now, they can't hold it up, but as we know with the federal voice, and this was the argument, that when the voice will go against a bill from any government, essentially any government that will go against the voice will probably be deemed inherently racist, and they will play it out in the media. It is going to be a handbrake on our democracy, and at the end of the day, we should not delineate our democracy on race. It is simple as that.
But Ben, I'm sorry. It's not a handbrake on your democracy. It's the death of your democracy. You do not have democracy in South Australia if some person with 6 votes or 11 votes or whatever it is can go onto the floor of Parliament and their opinion can sway legislation that the democratically elected and overrule, if you like, or influence the democratically elected body. It is the death of democracy. There is absolutely no place in a democracy for this sort of cronyism. And it must be repealed. And Peter Malinauskas, what you have done is shown that Labor's entire Indigenous First Nations voice program is a complete farce. It's a complete joke. You do not represent the Indigenous people of this country. They voted against you, Labor. Learn the lesson. Ben Hood, thanks so much for coming on. Outsiders, have a great Easter. And please get rid of this ridiculous thing out of the South Australian Parliament as soon as you get into power. After the break, lots more. Canberra Clown Show. Woohoo, so much to talk about. Roll up, step right this way. It's the greatest show on earth. It's the Easter Canberra Clown Show, right here under the Burley Griffin Big Top, where the circus is run along the simple premise of the 3 I's: ideology, idiocy, and incompetence. For example, part of Al Bozo's hilarious pantomime cabinet trick was to put 2 ministers in charge of one department. Yes, the Department of Climate Change, Energy, the Environment and Water has 2 Labor ministers running it, which means, by my definition, they will be twice as ideological, twice as idiotic and twice as incompetent. And as it turns out, twice as dangerous too, which may well explain why they are running the entire show behind closed doors and in the dark. Yes, this week for your titillation, ladies and gentlemen, allow us to entertain you with the hidden adventures of tight-lipped Tanya and her secret map. Yes, her secret map of the hidden threatened species of Australia that her department must have and is being kept hidden from the rest of us. Yes, even the lefty rag Crikey admits that Australia's new environment laws are weirdly being drafted behind closed doors. Quote from Crikey: "In a highly unusual process, dozens of representatives from key groups have found themselves in 3 closed-door sessions to view sections of the draft environment legislation." Ooh, what did they see behind these closed doors? Well, might you ask? Well, that's the point. We don't know what went on behind tight-lipped Tanya's closed doors session because, as Pauline Hanson explains, those who were invited behind her closed doors aren't allowed to disclose what they've seen there. Very, very mysterious.
I refer to commentary about the so-called nature positive plan by economic expert Robert Goblinson, published in the Australian newspaper 2 weeks ago, and I quote, the Albanese government is embracing some of the worst practices of dictator-driven governments to conceal controversial environmental measures. He also referred to stakeholders being required to sign NDAs, which is non-disclosure agreements, to see just part of this plan.
So what is going on? Penny Wise, the clown, Penny Wong, she's the one on the left there. She is one of tight-lipped Tanya's closest friends, but even Penny seemed all at sea when Pauline asked her in the Senate if she was aware of the legislation currently being drafted in secret with special non-disclosure agreements for the participants. Penny assumed Pauline was asking about the Religious Discrimination Act, even though Pauline hadn't mentioned it.
What? Well, order. Order. I'm not sure which legislation you refer to, Senator.
Which does kind of beg the question, how much legislation is the Albanese government formulating in secret behind closed doors with non-disclosure agreements? What else don't we know about? But anyway, allow us to shine a spotlight on the elephant in the room, Minister. It's tight-lipped Tanya and her terrifying, mysterious and subversive Nature Positive plan, part of the global Nature Positive by 2030 plan, which thanks to this show, Outsiders, is finally getting the exposure it so richly deserves. In fact, we're shining a gigantic clown-sized spotlight on it. Here are the hard-left Greening Australia mob waxing lyrical about Nature Positive, and I quote, "We currently live in what could be described as a nature-negative world, where human activity is driving an unprecedented decline and loss of species and ecosystems around the globe." Human activity, ooh, scary. And who can get us out of this dreadful nature-negative world? Why, none other than tight-lipped Tanya and clueless Chris and their shared bureaucracy. What could possibly go wrong with these clowns in charge? After all, who can forget this trio of blowhards, sorry, that was the autocorrect, trio of bureaucrats I introduced a couple of weeks ago.
Our panel today consists of James Tregurtha, who you've heard from already, and Ilse Kiesling from our biodiversity area. I'll be reading out questions provided to you for our panel. So we'll move on to our first question.
Yes, lots of questions about these new laws which are being drafted in secret and which critics say, as we were discussing earlier on the show, have the potential to decimate mining, devastate agriculture and wipe out much-needed development across this entire country, all in the name of saving a list of thousands of so-called threatened species such as the mealybug or the bog skink, and are worse in terms of transparency than even Albanese's secret voice plans. Here's Minister Wong struggling cluelessly to give us any information whatsoever about the transparent procedures surrounding tight-lipped Tanya's Nature Positive plan.
If you're referring to the Nature Positive Bill, which I think is the EPBC reform, I understand that consultation on drafts of the new laws is continuing, that there is a broad view that there is we need to deal with laws which are seen by many as ineffective and inefficient.
Oh, really? Seen as inefficient, our existing laws, are they? By whom? Let's not forget we arguably already have the most onerous environmental regulation and anti-development green tape in the world, and they want to make our anti-development laws even stricter.
We will continue to have threat abatement plans, but we also want to make sure that they are stronger and give better guidance about how to direct action around those threats. So we see the recovery strategies and the threat abatement plans really working in tandem in the future in much stronger ways than they currently do.
No wonder tight-lipped Tanya is keeping it all secret behind closed doors with everyone sworn to secrecy. Pauline, please explain.
According to Senator Wong, the Prime Minister and his government are meeting the requirements of the Code of Conduct for Ministers and upholding the principles of Australian democracy. However, we know that's simply not true. This is especially the case with the Nature Positive Plan. They're hiding it. They're keeping it secret. Stakeholders have been invited to see some parts of the plan, but the restrictions on these people are extraordinary and anything but democratic, transparent or accountable. Before they're allowed to even enter the room, they must sign a large confidentiality agreement with heavy penalties, which stops them from discussing the plan's contents or even going into the room in the first place. Stakeholders are told they can't take photographs of the draft legislation and can't take any part of it with them.
Now, I have heard similar stories from different sources. This nature-positive plan is being developed in secret with a facade of consultation, which is a lie. One key question being, where is the secret map developed by the Canberra bureaucrats that shows precisely all the new areas in which the Albanese government insists species are being threatened with extinction? The so-called critical areas with unacceptable impact will be stopped at the stroke of a bureaucrat's pen, potentially costing investors millions, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. Any new road, any new hospital, any new business, any new development might be halted in its tracks by tight-lipped Tanya or clueless Chris. So I repeat, where is the map? Because nobody seems to know.
And I'm warning the Australian people, keep your eye on this nature-positive plan because it's going to have a real impact on our environment, on the farmers, everything, and how we do business in this country. I'm telling people, the Australian people, wake up, Australia. Our democracy is being taken from us a piece at a time.
You are spot on, Pauline, about the dangers of the secret nature-positive plan. So I ask again, where is the map? Tight-lipped Tanya, or, as DX Bentley sings.
The only place I want to be is get us back to you and me. Draw me a map that leads me back to you.
Well, Rita and James, Donald Trump, they keep trying to get rid of him, but he keeps fighting back, Rita.
Well, yes, and is getting richer with the listing of Truth Social. Perhaps $4 billion richer, we're not sure exactly, but this is for this movement to bankrupt him and frustrate his efforts to get back into the White House. It seems to be backfiring. Every time there's a new politically motivated indictment, effort to seize his properties, his popularity surges.
and this comes just when he needed it too. You know, when he had that ridiculous judgment against him in the bogus fraud case where he was alleged to have gotten loans and paid them back, which apparently is now a crime. How dare he? Yes. How dare you? In New York. And it also just goes to, you know, it sticks in the craw of all these leftists who, Truth Social is not a real social media platform. You know, the whole business of fake. Well, the market is valued at billions of dollars. So he's got that money. He's got that that bond paid off to appeal, which was cut in half also by a judge this week.
And he paid cash. He paid, I think, 170-odd million US in cash. And interesting polling out from YouGov showing that sizable majority, over 60% of Republicans and Republican-leading independents, want Ron DeSantis to be the VP pick.
That's what I've always wanted to see, Rita.
Indeed.
Trump, DeSantis, we've said it here on the show. That's the dream ticket. The dream ticket.
Also, you'll maybe not have been paying attention to what Ron DeSantis has been doing in Florida. He has been kicking goals quietly all over the place. His latest thing now, there's been this horrendous trend in the United States of squatting, where lefty jurisdictions, you know, people can come in and basically steal your house when you're not there, and they squat and they stay there. He has signed a law outlawing that in Florida. So again, Florida leads the way in freedom in America, and to have him on the ticket would be great because it would give that sort of policy, legislative, executive experience.
And you see, this is what you need to watch the US report, 8 p.m. on Fridays, to get this sort of knowledge, because it's critical from James.
And what he said,
of course, Rita, at 11.
And what he said about those squatter laws is absolutely accurate. We had a case we showed from New York, this poor woman who'd gone to change the locks on her house that she pays property taxes on because squatters had taken over. She was led away in handcuffs. The cops came and arrested her because she had changed the lock.
Because it all starts from this, hard left proposition, that property is theft,
it's all ideology.
And so basically, if you're a homeowner, you're essentially, a settler colonialist in your own little sort of patch. So if it's stolen from you, the law in these left-wing jurisdictions doesn't care. The cops can't help you. And there are now services out there to help you get these people out, but they trash your house, they destroy it, or they hold parties in Atlanta. Somebody started a strip club in somebody's house. I mean, it's just unbelievable what's happening in the U.S. with this. It's just we're now at the point where we're now stealing people's houses. It's unreal.
And meanwhile, over in Afghanistan, the Taliban are resurgent and promising to go around stoning women for misdemeanors. This is the legacy of Joe Biden, the legacy of the left. We see it again and again. And terrorism thriving under Joe Biden and the Democrats. And, of course, Hamas are also can thank Biden for financing their little activities last October.
And I think we're going to end on a sort of an amusing note.
Yes.
Shakespeare has been deemed too white, too male, not just that, but also able-bodied, God forbid, heterosexual, cisgender male narratives. Because of Shakespeare's overrepresentation, apparently, in the theatre, that means that we are just dealing with this toxic male whiteness, Rowan, that is just turning people away from the theatre in droves. Because,
but as I said earlier, Rita, I mean, this is an assault on our culture, on our literature, our heritage, our artistry. This is what we're constantly under assault. Shakespeare too white. I mean, how ridiculous. But you mentioned ending on a lighter note. This amused me, will amuse a lot of people, James, how the CEO of Saudi Aramco has come out and said the transition to renewables is failing and the world should abandon the fantasy of phasing out oil. As we've been saying on this show for years, it ain't going to happen, folks. You can dream on, but stick with fossil fuels if you want a bright future and, more importantly, a strong future.
Yeah, and you can use fossil fuels to get you to nuclear, but you cannot, replace fossil fuels with solar and wind and hydro. I mean, it just really doesn't work. We see it again and again. We will need these things, and it's interesting. There was a fascinating piece from Adam Creighton in The Australian this week, which found that the curve of people wanting EVs has really started to fall off, and so over there, Biden is saying, well, we're going to step back from that. Here, of course, it's full steam ahead, or not steam, but full battery ahead with power.
Yeah, and the reason you know why they don't want nuclear, because if you have nuclear, you don't need renewables. You don't need wind and solar because you've got base load power.
In the meantime, have a very, very happy Easter from us all here on Outsiders.